Why would my father hide a letter inside a wall nobody was ever supposed to open? Ruth Macklin whispered as the yellowed envelope slipped from behind a row of rusted wrenches and landed on the concrete floor. The old repair shop had been called worthless for years. Her ex-husband had called it junk. The county assessor had called it obsolete. Even the realtor who kept leaving business cards under the door called it a teardown. Yet there, beneath 40 years of dust and motor oil, was an envelope with her name written in her father's unmistakable handwriting. Ruth stared at it while rain rattled against the corrugated metal roof overhead. For a moment, the building seemed to hold its breath with her. She hadn't opened the letter yet, but one thing was already clear. Somebody had gone to great lengths to make sure it stayed hidden. 3 days earlier, Ruth had walked out of a courthouse carrying everything that remained of her old life in a cardboard box. After 33 years of marriage, the inventory was surprisingly small. A chipped coffee mug that read World's Best Mom. A photo album with loose pages. A jewelry box her mother had given her before she died. The divorce papers. And the deed to Macklin Repair and Service, a failing repair shop on the edge of a small mountain town. Dennis had kept the house. Dennis had kept the retirement accounts. Dennis had kept the lake cabin. Ruth got the repair shop because nobody wanted it. "You can have that dump," he had said in the parking lot with a polite smile that somehow hurt more than shouting. "Maybe you can sell it for scrap." Ruth had not answered. She had simply climbed into a battered 2006 pickup truck with 168,000 miles on the odometer and driven south. The truck smelled faintly of gasoline and old upholstery. The passenger door only opened from the inside. Her checking account contained $211. The gas gauge hovered just above empty. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt numb. The repair shop sat where it always had, beside a 2-lane road that curved through the foothills. The faded sign still carried her father's name. One letter had fallen off years ago, leaving a dark outline on the metal. Weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt. The front windows were coated in grime. Yet when Ruth stepped out of the truck and looked at the building, she felt something she had not felt in months. Quiet. Not happiness. Not hope. Just quiet. The kind that arrives after the noise finally stops. She unlocked the door with an old brass key she had carried for 12 years without using. The hinges groaned. The smell hit her immediately. Oil, dust, cold metal, memories. Her father's reading glasses still rested on the counter beside a faded repair invoice. A calendar hung frozen on the month he died. Everything looked abandoned, but nothing looked forgotten. Over the next 2 days, Ruth cleaned. She swept floors, cleared workbenches, sorted through drawers packed with bolts, receipts, spark plugs, and old photographs. She found dozens of ordinary things. Then, late on the 3rd afternoon, while removing a rack of rusted tools from the wall, she noticed something strange. Every board in the wall was weathered the same way except for one narrow section. The paint was slightly newer. The screws were different, and scratched into the wood, almost invisible beneath decades of grime, were 4 words that made the hair rise on the back of her neck. Not for Dennis. The cardboard box on the passenger seat shifted as Ruth counted her remaining cash, $211. In small bills she had stacked carefully between 2 worn envelopes. Outside, the drizzle slicked the cracked asphalt, pooling in the dips of the faded parking lot. In her left hand, she held the deed to Macklin Repair and Service, slightly creased, corners curling from years in the county clerk's files. Her phone buzzed once, an automated reminder about the past due electric bill at the apartment she no longer had, and she ignored it, tucking it into the pocket of her coat. The pickup's passenger door groaned when she opened it to retrieve the jewelry box from under the seat, the one her mother had given her decades ago. Each item she lifted felt heavier than it looked. A photo album with the faded smiles of her children, a coffee mug chipped along the rim, and her mother's reading glasses with a cracked lens. She had signed the final divorce papers only 3 days ago. Dennis had slid them across the polished table with the cold efficiency of a banker, a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything else is yours," he had said, nodding toward the deed with a faint shrug, as though shrugging absolved him of taking more. She remembered the eviction notice taped to her old apartment door, the landlord's neat cursive handwriting declaring she had 30 days, no extensions, and the bank's letter denying her a small line of credit to cover rent. Even the grocery store cashier had raised an eyebrow when she tried to use the last of her savings. Ruth had nowhere to go, but she held on to what she could. The truck, the cardboard box, and the deed. Her final tangible link to a life that had been systematically stripped from her. She slid the keys into the ignition, the metal cold and slightly sticky from age, and the engine coughed before turning over. As the truck rattled toward the mountains, she noticed a subtle anomaly on the deed she hadn't seen before. The parcel number in the upper right corner had been altered, faint ink differing from the original printing, almost invisible unless the page caught the light at the right angle. Her stomach tightened. Someone had tampered with it, but who and why? The repair shop that everyone, including Dennis, called a junk heap, might now be more than it seemed. For the first time since leaving the courthouse, a fragile pulse of hope threaded through the numbness. This crumbling, overgrown building at the edge of town, dismissed by the world and claimed worthless, could be her last chance. And for the first time, Ruth realized that in the midst of all she had lost, this rubbish property might be the one thing that could give her control back over her life. The altered parcel number stayed on Ruth's mind the entire drive back into town. She parked beneath a flickering street lamp outside the county records office just before closing, the pickup engine ticking softly as it cooled. The building was small, red brick, and smelled faintly of paper, dust, and floor wax. Inside, a woman with silver hair and reading glasses, hanging from a chain around her neck, glanced up from behind the counter when Ruth slid the deed across the desk. "I need a copy of the original property file," Ruth said. The clerk adjusted her glasses and typed the parcel number into an aging computer. A moment later, her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. A pause that lasted 1 second too long. "Interesting," she murmured. "What is?" Ruth asked. "Nothing. Probably a filing correction from years ago." But the woman's fingers lingered on the keyboard. When she printed the property summary, she folded it before handing it over, as though she did not want anyone else nearby to read it. Ruth thanked her and stepped outside. In the truck, she unfolded the paper beneath the yellow glow of the dome light. The repair shop sat on just under 4 acres. 4 acres. Dennis had always called it a quarter-acre lot with an old building on it. She read the line again, then a third time. The county map attached to the file showed a faint pencil circle around the rear section of the property. No explanation. No notes. Just a circle. The next morning she met with the realtor who had been calling for days. His SUV was parked beside the repair shop before she arrived. "Morning, Ruth," he said with a practiced smile. "I can make this easy for you. Cash offer. Close in 10 days. He walked her through the numbers as if speaking to someone who did not understand arithmetic. The building needed repairs. The roof leaked. The equipment was outdated. The environmental inspection alone could be expensive. "Honestly," he said, glancing at the rusted garage doors, "it has almost no market value. Almost. Not none." Ruth noticed the difference. "Then why are you here?" she asked quietly. The smile slipped for half a second before returning. "Just trying to help." She declined the offer. Not because she believed the property was valuable. Not yet. But because every instinct she had spent 33 years ignoring was suddenly awake. After he left, she stood alone in front of the building. Wind pushed through the weeds growing along the foundation. One of the garage doors rattled softly. The repair shop looked exactly like what everyone said it was. An aging structure full of obsolete tools and forgotten memories. A burden. A joke. A consolation prize handed to the wife nobody expected to recover. Yet it was all she had. Ruth unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Sunlight filtered through dirty windows, laying pale stripes across the concrete floor. She walked slowly through the shop, touching workbenches, cabinets, tool chests, not searching for treasure, just trying to understand the place her father had loved enough to keep until the day he died. Near the back office, She found an old pegboard covered with rusted wrenches arranged in unusually neat rows. Most of the shop had fallen into disorder years ago. This wall had not. Her father had always believed tools should be returned exactly where they belonged. Ruth reached out and lifted one of the wrenches. Behind it, hidden by decades of dust, was a brass key smaller than any door key she had ever seen. She held it in her palm, staring at it as afternoon light glinted across the metal, unaware that the worthless repair shop everyone laughed at had been waiting for her to find that key for more than 12 years. The front door resisted her push, the rusty hinges groaning like a groan of years past. Ruth gripped the brass handle, the metal cold and speckled with rust, and stepped inside. The smell hit her first. A mixture of oil, dust, and something faintly sweet, like old coffee left to sour on a counter. Sunlight filtered through cracked panes, scattering on the floorboards warped and creaking under each careful step. She placed her cardboard box down near the back wall, the box wobbling as if it had been riding the truck for decades too, and opened it to rearrange a few personal items. Stacking the photo album and chipped coffee mug beside a tattered blanket she spread out on the corner as a makeshift resting spot. She knelt to test an outlet with a frayed cord. Nothing. She unzipped her coat and pulled out her phone to call Hank, but it went straight to voicemail. Ruth exhaled and moved toward the long workbench, brushing aside layers of dust to reveal her father's reading glasses, a half-finished repair order pinned beneath a paperweight, and a coffee mug with initials carved into its chipped rim. Every item was a ghost of the life that had once belonged here, a map of routine and love she had barely known. Her eyes wandered to the tool wall. Most tools hung crooked, some missing entirely, but one section of the wooden panels gleamed faintly, the varnish noticeably newer than the surrounding boards. Ruth reached out and ran a finger along the edge, feeling a slight bump, almost imperceptible, like someone had pressed the wood together from behind. A floorboard nearby emitted a hollow echo when she stepped on it, and a faint rattle from inside the walls made her pause, hand frozen midair. She bent down to inspect a corner where the paint was chipped and discovered tiny scratch marks forming a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. Somewhere in the shadows behind the workbench, a faint rustling suggested she was not alone. Perhaps a small animal, perhaps something left deliberately concealed. Ruth took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of turpentine and mildew, and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders before kneeling beside the workbench to move an old filing cabinet. As she did, a small piece of paper fell from beneath it, curling at the edges with age. Picking it up, she noticed a series of numbers faintly circled on the county map pinned to the wall above, the ink slightly newer than the rest. The light from the windows glinted off a metal panel on the tool wall that didn't quite align with its neighbors, catching her eye. Ruth froze, the pickup key still warm in her palm, realizing that for all appearances the repair shop was abandoned. Yet it was breathing, waiting, and that faint creak from the wall hinted it had secrets it had guarded for years. The rain continued to drum against the tin roof, each droplet a sharp reminder of the hours ahead. Ruth knelt on the cold concrete floor, hands already cut and red from sweeping broken glass and wrenching up rusted nails from warped floorboards. The box of her belongings sat beside her, the chipped coffee mug rattling with every shift of the tarp she pulled across a leaky section of the ceiling. Her knees ached from kneeling on uneven boards, and the damp from the morning drizzle had seeped through her sneakers. She started with the counters, wiping decades of grease from the surface with a rag she had salvaged from the back of the truck. Each motion revealed smudged receipts and notes her father had left, yellowed pages curling at the edges. One caught her eye, a small slip with a name she did not recognize, written in a neat hand, dated 20 years ago, pinned beneath a ledger whose pages were frayed and curling. She paused, wondering if it belonged to a customer, then dismissed it, tucking it into a drawer that refused to close completely. She moved to the workbenches, loosening screws on the tool cabinets, tightening bolts on rusted hinges, and improvising with duct tape to keep one stubborn door from swinging open when the wind gusted through a broken window. Water dripped from the ceiling above, forming puddles she carefully avoided as she rearranged cabinets and swept away layers of dust and debris. Between the dust particles floating in the sunbeams, she spotted a photo, the top corner cut off so that a familiar face was partially missing, lying under a stack of old repair orders. She gently lifted it, turned it over, and noticed a key tucked beneath the photo, its brass dulled with age. Ruth's heart skipped a beat. She tried to rationalize. Perhaps it fell from a drawer above, or from some forgotten box. But when she checked the drawer, it was locked from the inside. No way it could have fallen. Her phone buzzed weakly in her coat pocket, battery at 3%, reminding her that she still had bills to pay and prescriptions to refill, yet she focused on the tangible task at hand, making this place livable, one measured, deliberate motion at a time. She lit a camping stove to boil water for coffee, listening to the hiss and small cracks as the old fridge in the corner sputtered and died, and the faint scuff of the broom on glass that rattled against the frame. Each small act of cleaning, rearranging, and fixing brought a sense of control she hadn't felt in months. Yet, as she stacked loose tools and adjusted a crooked shelf, the key slipped from her. Fingers again, clinking against the floor. She picked it up slowly, turning it over in her palm, a metallic whisper in the quiet shop. Even in the midst of dust, water, and decay, Ruth realized with a shiver that she was uncovering something hidden, and that her labor, sweeping, tightening, arranging, was moving her closer to it without her even knowing. The next morning, the bell above the door jingled as Hank, the retired mechanic from down the road, stepped inside, carrying a brown paper bag filled with coffee and pastries. His eyes softened as they scanned the shop, lingering on the orderly pegboard and the small brass key Ruth had picked up the day before. "Your father helped people here," he said quietly, setting the bag on the counter. Ruth watched him, tracing a finger along the worn edge of the workbench. "Help them how?" she asked, keeping her voice low, almost as if asking louder would disturb the dust. Hank hesitated, then nodded toward a faded photo tucked behind a stack of invoices. There, a younger version of him stood with Ruth's father, both smiling near a fire-damaged garage that the town still whispered about, a receipt from the hardware store pinned to the corner. "Some things we try not to talk about," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Ruth stepped closer, noticing the ledger page she had found the day before, the same name as Hank written faintly in one corner. She picked up the photo, aligning it with the page, and felt a shiver. Hank reached behind the counter and handed her a small toolbox, old but sturdy, the kind her father might have lent a neighbor. "Keep it handy," he said, eyes flicking toward the back wall, the corner where the wood panel looked newer. "Some repairs aren't just for machines." Ruth nodded, examining the brass key in her palm. It glinted in the morning light streaming through the dusty windows. Hank smiled faintly, then stepped back into the doorway, his coat damp from the drizzle outside. "Don't lose track of this place," he said, voice low, almost a whisper. "Places like this, they remember the people who cared." Ruth felt the weight of the key anew, the faint scratch marks on the floor, and the smell of old coffee and machine oil mingling with the morning air. For the first time, the shop did not feel empty. It felt like someone had been waiting for her, someone who had known her father's intent and quietly protected it all these years. For the rest of that afternoon, Ruth could not stop thinking about the way Hank had looked toward the back wall before he left. It wasn't fear exactly. It was recognition, the kind that appears when someone notices an old scar beneath a shirt sleeve. She tried to focus on practical things. The leaking section of roof above Bay 2 needed another tarp. The side door still stuck when humidity climbed. The shelves along the west wall leaned nearly 2 inches out of level. There was more than enough work to keep her mind occupied. Yet every time she crossed the shop, her eyes drifted back toward the same section of pegboard. The section where she had found the brass key. The section where the wood looked just slightly newer than everything around it. That evening, rain returned. Water tapped steadily against the metal roof while wind pushed through gaps around the old garage doors. Ruth heated a can of soup on the camping stove and ate sitting on an overturned bucket beside the workbench. The radio she had found in a cabinet crackled to life for a few seconds before dissolving into static. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the windows, a truck passed along the highway. Then silence settled over the building again. After dinner, She grabbed a flashlight and walked back to the pegboard. At first she tried to explain everything away. Maybe the panel had been replaced after water damage. Maybe her father had repaired that section years ago. Maybe the scratches on the floor were from moving equipment. Reasonable explanations. Ordinary explanations. She ran the beam across the wall. Then she noticed something she had missed before. The floor beneath the pegboard carried faint scrape marks. Not random scratches. Parallel lines. As though something heavy had been dragged away from the wall multiple times. Ruth crouched and followed them. The marks disappeared beneath a row of old steel tool cabinets bolted to the concrete. She stood quietly for a moment. Then she walked to the office and retrieved an old photograph she had found earlier. In the picture, taken nearly 25 years ago, her father stood beside the same wall. Behind him sat only 2 cabinets. Today there were 4. Ruth compared the photo again. Her pulse quickened. The additional cabinets had been added later. She crossed back to the wall and measured the distance from the corner. The dimensions did not match the building layout shown on the county map. The shop should have been nearly 3 feet deeper at that point. She frowned and checked again. Same result. 3 missing feet. The flashlight beam swept upward. One cabinet was secured with bolts facing the opposite direction from all the others. Not installed. Deliberately locked into place. Outside, headlights briefly flashed through the dirty front windows. Ruth froze. A dark pickup sat across the road for several seconds before slowly pulling away. She could not see the driver. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered. Silence. Then the call disconnected. The knot in her stomach tightened. Someone was paying attention. She returned to the wall. This time she placed her ear against the wood and knocked gently with her knuckles. Solid. 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 Then hollow. Ruth stepped back immediately. She knocked again. Same result. A deep empty sound hidden behind the panel. Her breathing slowed as she followed the hollow section downward. Near the floor, almost completely concealed beneath layers of dust and old paint, she discovered a narrow vertical seam no wider than a credit card. And lodged inside that seam, nearly invisible in the flashlight beam, was a tiny brass keyhole that matched the key resting in her pocket. For several seconds, Ruth simply stared at the tiny brass keyhole hidden in the seam. Rain whispered against the roof overhead. Somewhere inside the building, water dripped steadily into a bucket she had placed beneath a leak earlier that day. Everything else felt unnaturally still. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and wrapped her fingers around the small brass key. It fit perfectly in her palm, worn smooth by decades of handling. The metal felt warmer than it should have. Her father had touched this key, maybe hundreds of times, maybe thousands. Ruth glanced toward the windows. Darkness pressed against the glass. The highway beyond had gone quiet. Whoever had parked across the road earlier was gone. At least for now. She inserted the key into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she felt resistance give way with a faint metallic click. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just enough to tell her that something hidden for years had finally been opened. Ruth pulled carefully. The panel moved less than an inch before stopping. Paint had sealed parts of the edge over time. She grabbed a flathead screwdriver from the workbench and worked it gently into the seam. Dust drifted into the flashlight beam. The wood creaked. Then the panel swung inward. Behind it was not a secret room. Not yet. Only a narrow cavity between walls. Barely 18 inches deep. At the bottom sat a rectangular metal box coated in dust and oil residue. Ruth knelt and lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected. The hinges were rusted but intact. A faded strip of masking tape crossed the lid. Written across it in black marker were 3 words. For Ruth only. Her throat tightened. She carried the box to the workbench and sat down on the stool her father had used for decades. For a moment she just looked at it. 33 years of marriage had taught her caution. 12 years of staying away had taught her regret. Neither prepared her for this. The latch opened with a soft snap. Inside lay a bundle of papers tied together with brittle twine. Beneath them rested several photographs and a small notebook no larger than a checkbook register. The smell that escaped was unmistakable. Old paper, dust, machine oil, time. Ruth carefully untied the bundle. The first document was not a deed, not a will, not a treasure map. It was a collection of county tax receipts. Year after year, 28 years of payments. Every receipt carried the same parcel number she had seen on the altered deed. The same number Dennis had always claimed belonged only to the repair shop. Ruth frowned and spread them across the workbench. The amounts were unusually high for a property supposedly worth almost nothing. She checked another receipt, then another. Same pattern. The notebook contained handwritten entries in her father's careful block letters. Dates, payment amounts, property references. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that explained why these records had been hidden inside a wall. Yet one detail kept repeating. Every few pages appeared the same notation. Protect Parcel B. Ruth flipped faster. Protect Parcel B. Protect Parcel B. Again and again. Her pulse quickened. She had never heard of Parcel B. The county map showed only one parcel. At least officially. One of the photographs slipped loose and landed face up on the workbench. Ruth picked it up. The image showed her father standing beside a younger Hank sometime in the late 1990s. Behind them sat the repair shop exactly as she remembered it. But that wasn't what caught her attention. In the background, partially obscured by a pickup truck, stood a sign she had never seen before. The sign carried 4 words painted in white lettering. Parcel B Access Road. Ruth stopped breathing for a moment, because according to every deed, map, and property record she had ever seen, Parcel B wasn't supposed to exist at all. Parcel B wasn't supposed to exist. Yet the photograph sat beneath Ruth's trembling fingers, proving that at some point it had existed openly enough to have its own sign. Rain continued tapping softly against the roof while the old workbench lamp cast a warm yellow circle across the papers spread before her. She picked up the photograph again, studying every detail. The sign was weathered but real. The access road behind the repair shop was real. And standing beside her father was Hank, 25 years younger, smiling in a way Ruth hadn't seen since returning to town. She turned to the notebook again. Protect Parcel B. Protect Parcel B. The phrase appeared so many times it stopped looking like a note and started looking like a promise. The next morning, Ruth drove to Hank's house before sunrise. A thin layer of fog hung over the fields. Hank answered the door holding a coffee mug and wearing the same faded work jacket he had probably owned for 20 years. When Ruth showed him the photograph, something changed in his face. Not surprise, recognition, then sadness. He stared at the image for a long moment before sitting heavily on the porch steps. I wondered if he'd hidden that picture somewhere, he said quietly. Ruth sat beside him. What was Parcel B? Hank looked out toward the road instead of answering immediately. A school bus passed in the distance. Your father never thought land was just land, he finally said. Most people see acres. Earl saw families. Ruth waited. Hank rubbed his thumb along the rim of his coffee cup. Back in the 90s, when the mill shut down, a lot of folks around here lost everything. Houses, jobs, insurance. Some couldn't afford medicine. Some couldn't pay property taxes. He paused. Your father started buying little pieces of land nobody wanted. Small parcels. Odd lots. Places developers ignored. Ruth frowned. Why? Hank laughed softly. Because he was stubborn. Then his expression darkened. And because he believed people deserved a second chance. Over the next hour, pieces emerged one by one. Not as a grand story. As fragments. Receipts. Names. Memories. Earl had quietly paid delinquent tax bills for widows. He had let a young family park a trailer behind the repair shop for nearly 2 years without charging rent. He had purchased prescription medication for a retired miner who couldn't afford heart medicine. He had even helped cover heating costs for the church one winter after a pipe burst. Ruth listened in silence. None of it sounded like the father she remembered from childhood. Not because it wasn't true, because she had never known. She remembered a man who smelled like motor oil and soap. A man who fixed engines and worked long hours. She had never known how many lives existed beyond the edges of those memories. Before she left, Hank disappeared inside the house and returned carrying a worn manila envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. "Found this after Earl died," he said. "Never knew what to do with it." Ruth carefully opened the envelope. Inside were copies of old utility bills, handwritten notes, and several receipts. One receipt immediately caught her attention. The amount was $487.62, paid in full. The recipient's name had been blacked out, but the signature line remained visible. Earl Macklin. Beneath it was another name.
A witness signature.
Dennis Walker. Ruth's stomach tightened. Dennis. Years before they married. Years before anyone had mentioned Parcel B. Hank saw her expression and looked away. "That's the part nobody likes talking about," he said. "Some people benefited from what Earl was doing. Some people wanted control of it." Ruth looked down at the receipt again, then at the notebook, then at the photograph. For the first time, she understood something important. Her father had not hidden these records because he was ashamed of them. He had hidden them because he was protecting something. And somehow, long before she lost her home, long before the divorce, long before Dennis called the repair shop worthless, Earl had already begun leaving a trail that pointed directly back to her. The trail that Earl Macklin had left behind refused to stay buried. By the time Ruth drove back to the repair shop, the manila envelope sat on the passenger seat beside the notebook, the receipts, and the old photograph. The morning sun had finally broken through the clouds, lighting the mountains in pale gold, but the knot in her stomach remained. She kept replaying Hank's words. Some people wanted control of it. Not wanted. Still wanted. Back at the shop, Ruth spread everything across the workbench beneath the old lamp. The notebook, the tax receipts, the utility records, the photograph showing the sign for Parcel B. One by one, she photographed each document with her phone and began comparing dates. Her father had been meticulous. Every receipt was logged. Every payment matched a handwritten entry. Then she noticed something strange. Parcel B appeared on county tax records for years after it supposedly disappeared from public maps. Not occasionally. Consistently. Someone had continued paying taxes on land that officially no longer existed. Ruth drove straight to the county records office. The same clerk with the silver glasses looked up when she entered. This time, when Ruth placed the notebook and a copy of the photograph on the counter, the woman's expression tightened. "Where did you get these?" she asked quietly. Ruth didn't answer immediately. The clerk glanced toward the hallway before lowering her voice. Parcel B wasn't erased because of a survey error. She hesitated. It was merged. Ruth frowned. Merged into what? The clerk turned her monitor slightly. Old digitized maps filled the screen. Parcel B had once connected the repair shop to nearly 18 acres of adjacent land running along the creek behind town. 18 acres. Ruth stared at the image. The repair shop wasn't sitting on 4 acres at all. The original property controlled access to more than 22 acres combined. Woodland, creek frontage, road access, the kind of land developers spent years trying to assemble. Her pulse quickened. "Who owns it now?" she asked. The clerk's eyes moved across the screen. Then she froze. "That's odd." "What?" "Ownership records were modified 17 years ago." Ruth felt cold. "Modified by who?" The clerk didn't answer. Instead, she printed several pages and slid them across the counter. At the bottom of one filing sat a familiar name. Dennis Walker. Ruth stared at it. Not as owner. Not exactly. As witness. Again. The same role he had played on the receipt Hank showed her. The same role appearing again and again around documents involving Parcel B. The clerk looked uncomfortable. "You didn't get this from me." Ruth left with the papers tucked inside her coat. As she stepped into the parking lot, her phone rang. A known number. She answered. A calm male voice greeted her. "Mrs. Macklin, my name is Robert Hayes. I represent an investment group interested in acquiring your repair shop. Ruth kept walking. Not for sale. Of course, the man said pleasantly. We're only trying to help. The structure is unsafe. Expensive liabilities can become overwhelming. Ruth ended the call. 3 minutes later, a second call came. This time from a local developer she had never met. The offer was nearly triple what the realtor had proposed days earlier. By sunset, a third offer arrived in her voicemail. The repair shop everyone had called worthless was suddenly attracting. Tension. Too much attention. Back at the building, Ruth locked the front door and spread the new county records beside her father's notebook. The puzzle pieces were finally starting to fit together. Parcel B wasn't just hidden land. It controlled access to every acre behind the repair shop. Whoever controlled that access controlled the entire tract. But as she studied one final document, her breath caught. Tucked into the county file was a notarized property amendment that had never been recorded publicly. And at the bottom of the page, beside Earl Macklin's signature, appeared a second signature that made everything far more dangerous. Dennis Walker had signed it 6 months before he started dating Ruth. By the next morning, the quiet tension around Macklin Repair had shifted. Ruth arrived to find a sleek black SUV parked in the shadow of the garage, its engine still warm. The driver's window lowered to reveal Dennis Walker, impeccably dressed, voice calm but precise. Ruth, he began, handing her a folder. I never expected this property to become valuable, but it has. I'm simply ensuring fairness. Family fairness. Ruth opened the folder. Inside were several documents. A petition for temporary control, a lien placed 6 months ago, and an appraisal citing the building's structural hazards. You understand, Dennis continued, that maintaining this structure safely is a significant burden. It might be better for everyone if we manage it differently. Ruth's hand tightened around the brass key still in her pocket. She did not answer. She flipped through the petition, noting her lack of legal counsel and the impossibility of immediately contesting the lien. The appraisal described outdated wiring, rotted floorboards, and a failing roof. All facts, but emphasized to justify external control. As she read, her phone vibrated. A second call, a voice she recognized. An attorney associated with a local developer. Procedurally, he said, the property could be condemned for non-compliance. Safety codes are being enforced. You may want to reconsider. Ruth's eyes darted between the papers, the key, and the ledger she had photographed from the notebook. She felt the familiar ache of being underestimated, dismissed, ignored, but her hands did not shake. She photographed the petition and lien notices, stored the originals safely in her backpack, and compared the signatures to her father's ledger entries. One signature appeared slightly altered. The timestamp on the scanned deed did not match the filing date. Her pulse quickened. Outside, the SUV's engine started again, moving slowly along the road, as if watching. Dennis's voice came from the driveway. You've done a good job keeping things tidy, Ruth, but we both know this isn't a game you can win alone. She noticed that a receipt fell from one of the petition envelopes, folded at the edge, with a witness name she recognized from Hank's stories. Another clue, a ledger page previously missing, was tucked behind the appraisal. She paused, tracing her fingers along the faint pencil marks her father had made years ago. For the first time, Ruth realized that Dennis now regarded the property with a seriousness he had never shown before, calling it valuable, referencing family, questioning her ability to manage it, all while she held evidence he could not yet refute. Her mind raced. The sun glinted off the key in her palm. Every document they brought, every polite threat, every procedural notice. They all hinted at the same thing. If she did not act, she could lose Macklin Repair again. But this time, she had a ledger, a photograph, and a series of receipts that Dennis had never expected her to find. The county conference room was hushed when Ruth entered, the fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. Papers, folders, and binders were spread across the long table like a battlefield. Dennis Walker sat at the far end, his suit crisp, pen poised over a petition, eyes cold. Ruth placed the ledger, the photographs, and the manila envelope containing the receipts in front of her. The room went silent. She opened the ledger first, flipping through pages marked with her father's careful block letters. Each page corresponded with receipts, dates, and payment amounts. One entry in particular caught everyone's attention. A notarized record of Parcel B's taxes paid in full, signed by Earl Macklin, with Dennis's name listed as witness, the same witness line that had been used to try to claim temporary control. Ruth picked up the photograph showing her father beside Hank, standing at Parcel B access, and laid it beside the ledger, aligning the details with the ledger entries. Dennis cleared his throat. "These are merely procedural anomalies," he said. "The filings might be clerical. You must understand, at your age and with your financial situation, managing." Ruth cut him off, placing the brass key and a receipt from the hardware store that bore his signature atop the ledger. "You witnessed this," she said calmly. "You signed it. It is your acknowledgement." Her hand hovered over the manila envelope. Slowly, she pulled out the bundle of receipts, each marked meticulously by her father, every payment traceable, each one cross-referenced with Parcel B on the county map. Hank, seated at the corner, cleared his throat. "She's telling the truth," he said softly, voice steady, eyes flicking toward Dennis. Ruth unfolded the old notebook and revealed the page marked Protect Parcel B repeatedly, tracing the pencil lines as the room absorbed the detail. Dennis's pen froze midair. He looked pale, the carefully practiced calm slipping. The county clerk present shifted uncomfortably, adjusting her glasses, aware of the consistency between the ledger, the receipts, the photograph, and the envelope. Ruth opened the last document, a bank letter with a postmarked seal from 15 years ago, confirming an escrow account maintained by Earl Macklin for Parcel B expenses, untouched and inaccessible to anyone but her. The weight of the evidence pressed down, and Dennis could say nothing further. The room remained silent for a long, measured breath. Every object she laid down, the ledger, the receipts, the photograph, the brass key, the bank letter, formed a chain impossible to dispute. Ruth sat back slightly, hands resting on the edge of the table, and finally understood. The repair shop and Parcel B were no longer worthless. Her father's legacy, her property, and the proof of years of meticulous safeguarding were hers to command. But even in that silence, she felt the faintest tremor of uncertainty. Decisions remained. How would she use what her father had protected? The power to reclaim, to restore, to choose, lay entirely in her hands. The decision rested in Ruth's hands long after the county meeting ended. The petition was denied. The lien challenge was dismissed pending investigation. The Property Records Office began correcting the parcel history, restoring Parcel B to its rightful chain of ownership. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Earl Macklin's records were no longer hidden in walls, forgotten boxes, or dusty filing cabinets. They were recognized, officially, publicly. Truth had finally stepped into daylight. Dennis never apologized. Men like Dennis rarely did. But within weeks, the quiet confidence he had carried for years disappeared. The county opened a review into several property filings connected to the amended records. His attempt to gain control of the repair shop failed completely. The developers who had called daily stopped calling. The offers vanished. The pressure vanished. And one morning, Ruth watched a moving truck pull away from the office Dennis had been using in town. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. The town simply understood. The story they had been told for years was not the truth. Back at Macklin Repair, life returned slowly. The roof was repaired first. Volunteers appeared without being asked. Hank brought lumber. The hardware store owner donated paint. A retired electrician rewired part of the building. People Ruth barely remembered showed up carrying coffee, tools, sandwiches, and stories. They pointed to corners of the shop and told her about engines Earl had fixed for free, rent he had quietly paid, winters he had helped families survive. Every story filled another empty space she never knew existed inside her father. By autumn, the faded sign above the building came down. Ruth stood on a ladder holding a paintbrush while Hank steadied the base below. Together they restored the lettering one careful stroke at a time. Macklin Repair and Service. When the final coat dried, she stepped back and looked at it for a long time. Not because it was beautiful, because it belonged. The old office became something new, part workshop, part community space. One corner held shelves with donated tools people could borrow. Another held a small emergency fund created from the escrow account Earl had left behind. The fund paid utility bills, prescription costs, and emergency repairs for families facing the same kind of desperation Ruth had once faced herself. Nothing extravagant, just enough to help someone stay afloat, just enough to give another second chance. The brass key remained on her desk. The same key that had once opened a hidden panel now rested inside a small glass frame beside the photograph of Earl and Hank standing near the old Parcel B sign. The ledger sat nearby as well. Not hidden anymore. Not evidence of debt. Not evidence of secrets. Evidence of care. Evidence that someone had spent decades protecting people when nobody was watching. One evening, nearly a year after she first unlocked the building, Ruth locked the front door and stood beneath the repaired porch light. The mountains were dark silhouettes against the fading sky. Through the windows she could see the warm glow of the shop, the framed key, the ledger, and her father's reading glasses resting on the counter exactly where she wanted them. Her phone buzzed. A customer had left a message. "Thank you, owner." Ruth listened to the word twice before putting the phone away. Owner. Not burden. Not failure. Not the woman left with the junk property. Owner. She smiled softly and slipped the brass key into her pocket. The same key that once opened a hidden compartment now opened the front door every morning. And as the light from the shop spilled across the pavement and into the quiet town beyond, Ruth finally understood what her father had been protecting all those years. It was never just land, never just a building, never just a deed. It was a place where people who had nowhere left to go could still belong. And the thing everyone had called worthless had simply been waiting for someone wounded enough to understand its value, kind enough to preserve it, and patient enough to open what had been hidden inside.